Hello and welcome to the American people and to all the citizens around the world watching this address. I want to speak to you today about the Russian nuclear threat and the use of nuclear weapons that Russia is threatening in Ukraine. I want to speak directly to Vladimir Putin, all those involved in the Russian government, and to the Russian people as well. I want you to hear me say clearly and forthrightly that any use of nuclear weapons, tactical battlefield nukes, any type of nuclear detonation, or any destruction of a nuclear facility in Ukraine will be met with a decisive response by the United States and NATO as a collective. And that response will be, we will find, seek out, and destroy every single conventional Russian military force in Ukraine, Crimea, and we will sink every ship in the Black Sea. That will be the consequence of any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Now, I hope that we can avoid any escalation of this conflict. I hope we can come to the table. That's the number one thing. I'm willing to sit down and talk with Vladimir Putin and with members of the Russian Federation to come to an agreement and end this conflict. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the channel. It's Ryan here. Thanks so much for tuning in. This video is obviously a little bit different than the rest, but I've been getting hit up a lot on Instagram with people asking me about the escalation of nuclear threats in Russia. I'm a scholar of military history, military theory, world events, political happenings, and the such, so I thought that I would bring it to everyone's attention and just have a discussion about it. I'm really excited about that. So before we get going, please dominate that like button, maybe even subscribe so we can get this video in front of more people. We can keep the conversation going and ultimately, hopefully, mostly avoid any World War III type scenarios. That's the number one thing. So I don't want you to take this as a completely hawkish video. I hope that doesn't come across that way. For me, this is more of a discussion and a collaboration with you to see what you think and hopefully to just get some information out there where we can all just come to the table and learn more and hopefully learn how to avoid any type of use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So to start out, I wanna say welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're here and thanks for tuning in to what might be a little bit different than what you've seen in the past, but it's gonna be all good. Let's dive in. So let's talk about some Russian background. Well, first of all, if you go back to the early days, the medieval days of Russia, Russia was essentially founded by early Scandinavians who were even prior to the Viking times. But then eventually, as they do, the Vikings moved in, and the first prince of the biggest city in Russia was a Viking. His name was Prince Oleg, and he ran a city called Kievan Rus. So initially, Vikings were the leaders of Russia. So what does that mean? Ryan, why are you talking about Vikings? Have you just been on a binge watching the show Vikings? Well, yes, but that's besides the point. Ultimately, I think it comes down to understanding who you're dealing with. So I like to go back to the roots of people and understand where they come from when you're coming to the table to discuss certain things, and hopefully coming to the table with Russia and Ukraine is going to happen soon. So with Vikings, obviously it comes down to being incredibly intense, being someone who can withstand extremely harsh situations. If you're gonna survive in Russia, you're gonna need to be tough. So that's why the Russian people have the reputation of being tough. And when you see Vladimir Putin up there riding on his horses, you know that he's carrying on that Viking tradition of presenting yourself as strong and tough, because that's how you're going to lead people who respect that. And it's just really cold up there. So if you've ever been to Boston in the wintertime and everybody is just kind of on edge yelling at each other, it's because they're cold and a little frustrated. So Russia is essentially Boston on steroids. So why is Russia in Ukraine, and why is that dangerous? Well, first of all, it's worth noting that Ukraine has an estimated $2 trillion of natural gas and oil reserves that is in Ukraine itself and in the area to the south near the Black Sea. So Russia's grabbing that because they see that as a way to continue to compete on the world stage with the United States. I mean, if you control that many more resources, you're gonna be able to fight against the fact that the United States is in charge of the International Monetary Fund. We have the reserve currency. So they want a leg up and they want a way to fight against that. Also, Vladimir Putin wants to reunite what he calls Russian property. So he wants to bring back in Ukraine, which he claims to be the sovereign territory of Russia, which it obviously is not. It's a sovereign country, but that's what's driving Vladimir Putin in this campaign as well. And that natural resources part is something worth noting. And this is why Russia loves the fact that in the United States, when we shut down certain fossil fuel productions, it essentially gives Russia a leg up. For example, shutting down things like the Keystone XL pipeline, other fossil fuel creating enterprises basically drove Europe into the hands of Russia, where Germany created a pipeline to Russia where Russia could turn on and turn off Germany's energy, their heat. So it essentially puts them in a bad place. So this is why Russia wants to control massive amounts of resources, because they see the United States as trying to go to these green policies extremely soon. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't go to green policies eventually, but when you try to do it overnight, you put people in a bad position where they're gonna be dependent on countries like Russia to even heat their homes. So Russia's strategy is to become an even more massive provider of fossil fuels, and taking over Ukraine is just one more way to make them a stronger producer of those fossil fuels, and hopefully in their minds, make other regions, other countries dependent on them for their energy. So the Russian strategy was for them to roll in and take Ukraine in a week. That was their ideal scenario. Obviously, that didn't happen for a lot of reasons. First of all, Ukrainians are NATO trained. They're not a part of the NATO alliance, but they are NATO trained. And then second of all, the US, it's worth noting, we're essentially fighting a proxy war with Russia, with the Ukrainian military, with all the different supplies that we're sending to keep Russia at bay. So those things combined have made it extremely difficult for Russia to make progress in Ukraine. So Russia changed their strategy. They've recently annexed 4 different regions of Ukraine. Those regions are Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Those regions were annexed by Russia and made to seem that the citizens in those regions were actually voting for it. But it's pretty funny because Russia even allowed people in mainland Russia to vote to annex those regions. So they were like, yeah, these people have ties to the region. And the people are like, yeah, I saw that region on a map once. And Russia's like, yeah, come on in, do that little voting thing in there. So obviously these elections are not valid, but Russia's trying to claim that they are. But this is how Russia works. So even in a race for, let's say, mayor or governor, Russia will have an election, but they'll bring in someone who is an employee of the state to run against the candidate that they know is going to win. And they want it to seem like there is a democracy happening, like there's the opportunity for each of these people to have a fair shot at getting elected, but the Kremlin knows who's going to get elected before the votes are even cast. But what this does is it allows Russia, in their minds, to present the idea that they're a democracy. So they think on the world stage that their perception of being a democracy will be slightly applauded or respected so that they can have clout when it comes to international issues. But at the end of the day, all their elections are previously decided, just as these votes in these annexed regions of Ukraine were. So more on the Russian strategy. So let's talk about Vladimir Putin. He is a former KGB spy and he's a military strategist. He reads a lot of the same military books that I know I've read going through the different schools to rise in the ranks of the US Air Force. One of those books is Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu talks about using deception as a way to defeat a superior enemy. And that's definitely what Vladimir Putin is attempting to do in Ukraine. So why face a more prepared enemy like the United States, NATO-trained Ukrainian forces, when you can use deception to defeat them? And that's been Russia's strategy against the United States for a long time. So overall, Russia is using a lot of the deception that's found in Sun Tzu and other military strategy books. And one of those tactics is called a false retreat. So they've recently annexed those 4 regions, and now they're coming out and saying that Ukraine's actually making some progress in chipping away at territory that was held by Russia. So what they're doing is they're setting up Ukraine to basically make it look like they're taking over sovereign Russian territory, which we know that these fake votes just essentially created this sovereign territory out of nowhere. But Russia's gonna use that as a way to justify greater and greater force. And who knows, eventually they could use it to justify using nuclear weapons. Russia's even started to change their laws to allow for a sooner use of nuclear weapons than they did before. So let's step to a broader strategy when it comes to these military strategy books like Sun Tzu and others, and it's deception that's been used against the United States for decades. I want to talk to you about former KGB propagandist operative Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov defected to the United States, and he gave a lot of hints and tips about what Russia is doing to try to crumble the United States from within. So he said that 15% of the KGB at the time, now it's called the FSB, was used for things like straight up James Bond and Mission Impossible style missions. So the things that we see in the movies, where 85% was actually used to deceptively try to destruct the United States from within with propaganda. And that propaganda is called ideological subversion. And the gist of it, the bottom line, is it is essentially meant to create confusion inside a population and division where nothing can really be done. And we all just fight among ourselves, and we're not able to deter threats like Russia when they try to do things like take over Ukraine. So it's a way for them to control the entire globe by destructing the United States from within. Roll that clip from Yuri.
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality. No one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students. Exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized."
So it's interesting, right? When you hear Yuri Bezmenov talk about the strategy that's being used to weaken the United States, a lot of it is being played out in real time. So when we see PC and woke culture, which tells us to cancel each other and not talk to each other, not come to the table, that's perfect. That's exactly what Russia wants. They don't want us to be able to have conversations. They don't want us to be able to have the ability to solve problems together. They want it to seem like we're enemies with each other so that we are divided from within, so that we can't deter a threat like Russia who wants to go and take over Ukraine. So this is classic Russian strategy. So Russia has even recently come out with even more confusion that they're trying to pump into American society when they said that US states could leave the United States and become a part of Russia. Basically, they're saying like it's better to just cancel each other, right? Cancel those other states. The states should secede, which can't be done. A state can't unilaterally decide to secede. But that's the cancel culture that they're trying to promote, right? So instead of having conversations, instead of going out and knocking on doors and supporting the political candidate you want, or just voting for a new one when the time rolls around for the next election, they're saying, no, cancel each other. But again, they want that division. They want that confusion. That's what they thrive on. So in the US political system, we have a way to change our government, which is beautiful. But in Russia, they want us to think we don't. They want us to think that anything we do is futile. They want that confusion to seep in and divide us. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the more we band together, the more we sit down, share a nice cup of coffee or whatever your choice of beverage may be, and just chat, discuss about how do we fight these threats that are external, that are trying to tell us that we're so divided inside. Maybe they have an ulterior motive in making us feel so divided. So instead, as Americans, sitting down, talking with each other, and just understanding that we all come from different walks of life and that we're stronger together, that's the real way to fight threats like Russia. But back to the nuclear conundrum. So how do we avoid World War III and keep someone like Vladimir Putin from being, making a terrible mistake because he's backed into a corner because things aren't going the way that he thought they would? Well, I say, Vlad, let's just dogfight each other, man. And how about this? We'll do it in Su-30s. So you can do it in a jet that Russia has some experience with, and you can have 10 flights, 10 practice flights. I'll have 0. We'll go up and dogfight each other, and we'll end this whole conflict. What do you say? But think of how John F. Kennedy prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He used creative solutions. He used a naval blockade around Cuba to keep things from escalating. So that's what we need now. We need creative solutions, but we also need definitive lines where we tell people not to cross, where we tell Vladimir Putin, hey, repeatedly, you are not going to do this without severe consequences to you. Because ultimately, as we've talked about before, that might be all that speaks to him and keeps him from making that horrible mistake of using nuclear weapons. So my overall opinion is, let's broker a deal. There should be 100 different strategies prior to any use of nuclear weapons, or personally any use of force in general. That's something I learned by being in combat, is that there should be so many things that happen first to prevent going to war, because ultimately war is horrible, and anyone who's been there will tell you that. And some of the reasons why I said what I did in my initial speech at the beginning of this video was because of General David Petraeus. He's the former director of the CIA. He was a 4-star general, and he had some really good things to say in a recent article by The Guardian. You don't want to get into a nuclear escalation here, but you have to show that the threats, cannot be accepted in any way. So I like that he's definitive there and like, yeah, we're trying to avoid World War III, but you can't be pushed around by a dictator and allow him to flippantly make threats like that. General Petraeus goes on to say, just to give you a hypothetical, we would respond by leading a NATO, a collective effort that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea, and every ship in the Black Sea. So that's definitive, that's to the point, that's what our president needs to be relaying to the Russian Federation every single day, and I really hope that they are. So I'd love to hear from you. Please comment below. Let me know what you think about the situation. As long as you're not some Russian bot. I think it's hilarious when I get the Russian bots commenting on my posts. Most of all, I'm so glad you're here. And before you go, why not just dominate that like button, maybe even subscribe. Let me know if you like these videos about current events. Don't worry, I'll have much more aviation content coming to you as well, but I think it's important that we all stay current on what's going on. So glad you were here. Most of all, hope you have a great day.